History often turns not on speeches or declarations, but on messages received in silence, typed lines of ink that arrive in the dark and quietly rearrange the balance of the world. In the early hours of June 1942, while London slept beneath blackout curtains and the weight of a global war pressed down on every corridor of power, such a message arrived. It did not announce triumph with fanfare. It whispered it. And for the men who understood what those words truly meant, it was almost impossible to believe. What followed was not just news of a naval battle. It was the first clear signal that the war had changed hands. At 3:17 a.m. on June 5, 1942, an encrypted telegram reached the Admiralty in London. Commander James Whitfield, the duty officer assigned to the night watch, broke the seal expecting nothing more than routine updates from the Pacific, ship movements, reconnaissance summaries, perhaps another grim report of losses. Instead he froze. The message was brief, clinical, and staggering. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers confirmed sunk. The USS Yorktown lost. Enemy forces in retreat. Whitfield reread the decoded transmission once. Then again. Then a third time. He had spent 17 years in naval intelligence. He understood carrier warfare, sortie rates, deck cycles, and the unforgiving arithmetic of naval aviation. Japan had brought 6 fleet carriers to Pearl Harbor just 7 months earlier, the same force that had annihilated Battleship Row and humiliated the Western democracies in a single morning. And now, according to this telegram, 2/3 of that strike force had been destroyed in a single engagement. It bordered on the impossible. Whitfield carried the message down 3 flights of stairs to the secure office of the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. The Admiralty building, wrapped in blackout curtains, felt like a labyrinth, corridors bathed in red light, crowded with exhausted officers managing a war Britain was slowly, inexorably losing. Pound read the telegram 3 times beneath the weak glow of his desk lamp. The walls around him told a harsher story than any coded message ever could. Atlantic charts showed convoys bleeding faster than British shipyards could replace them. In the Mediterranean, pins marked the grinding retreat in North Africa, where Rommel's Africa Corps pushed British forces backward month after month. And then there was the Indian Ocean. There were no pins there at all. British naval power had simply vanished from Asian waters. Singapore had fallen in February, 60,000 troops surrendered in the worst military disaster in modern British history. Prince of Wales and Repulse lay on the seabed of the South China Sea, sunk by Japanese aircraft in a battle that finally proved battleships no longer ruled the seas. The Eastern Fleet had withdrawn west to Ceylon, then retreated again toward Africa, shadowed by Japanese carriers Britain lacked the strength to challenge. And now this. The Americans were claiming victory over the very enemy that had driven Britain entirely out of Southeast Asia. Pound set the telegram down and stared again at the maps. 3 oceans. The Royal Navy was expected to protect convoys, defend bases, and maintain imperial communications across all of them simultaneously. Britain possessed 5 operational aircraft carriers. 2 guarded Atlantic convoys. Removing them would mean merchant ships dying by the dozens. 2 more fought in the Mediterranean, sustaining Malta and restraining Italian naval forces. The 5th, HMS Formidable, sat damaged in a Norfolk shipyard, being repaired by American workers because British yards were overwhelmed. 5 carriers. Total. The Americans, according to this telegram, had concentrated 3 Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, at a single point in the Pacific and destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers in return. The concentration alone was something Britain could no longer afford. The victory suggested something even more unsettling. Strategic vision backed by industrial power on a scale that made British efforts feel almost antiquated. Pound had watched the Empire contract week by week since Pearl Harbor. Territory lost. Ships sunk. Retreat after retreat. British planners understood the truth even if they refused to say it aloud. Britain could endure. Britain could resist. Britain could survive. But Britain could not win alone. If the American victory at Midway was real, if it did not dissolve into disappointment by morning, it meant something profound. It meant the Allies possessed offensive power in the Pacific. It meant Japanese carrier dominance had been broken. It meant American naval strength had matured into something capable of deciding battles, not merely absorbing defeats. Pound drafted a short message to Churchill, then in Washington with President Roosevelt. American carriers report major victory in Central Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers claimed destroyed. Awaiting confirmation. Then he ordered his staff to begin recalculating British strategy across every theater of war. Because if the telegram was accurate, the entire balance of imperial defense had shifted, and Britain needed to know whether it had shifted in its favor, or revealed just how completely British survival now depended on American power 6,000 miles away. By morning, the numbers told a brutal story. The Royal Navy was stretched beyond limits that would have been unsustainable even in peacetime. The Atlantic demanded constant escort. Without convoys, Britain would starve within months. 2/3 of its food was imported. German U-boats prowled relentlessly, sinking ships faster than replacements could be built. The Mediterranean consumed another fleet, guarding Malta and supplying Egypt. Every ship sent there was one unavailable elsewhere. And then there was India, the foundation of the empire. India supplied millions of soldiers, factories, raw materials, and economic strength. By June 1942, much of Asia was gone or under threat. Singapore had collapsed. Rangoon had fallen, severing the Burma Road. The Dutch East Indies were lost. Japanese forces stood at the edge of Australia. The Eastern Fleet, outmatched and outdated, had retreated under Admiral Sir James Somerville. When Japanese carriers struck Ceylon in April, Somerville withdrew, because annihilation would have been worse than retreat. The lesson was unmistakable. Britain could not contest Japanese carrier power in Asia. If Japan drove into the Indian Ocean, India itself would fall, and with it, Britain's ability to wage global war. That was the reality Pound faced as confirmation arrived. Four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been sunk near Midway. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier strength had decreased. And Britain had played no role in it. The Americans had broken the codes, positioned the trap, executed the ambush. British officers studied the reports with growing unease. This was not luck. It was mastery. Cryptography, intelligence integration, timing, geometry, executed flawlessly. Midway forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans were no longer learning. They had arrived. The fortress that had endured 8 relentless months of German assault in 1941 collapsed almost at once when the enemy returned. Tobruk, long a symbol of stubborn resistance, fell in a matter of hours. Churchill would later write that its loss was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. It was no exaggeration. Tobruk was more than a defensive position on a map. It had come to represent British resilience in North Africa, the proof that British troops could stand their ground against German armor, that discipline and resolve could still hold against mechanized warfare. Its sudden collapse suggested something far more troubling, that British forces, stretched thin and starved of resources, were approaching the limits of what courage alone could accomplish against a better-equipped enemy. President Roosevelt's reaction revealed the depth of American commitment. "What can we do to help?" he asked quietly. Within hours, American planners were arranging emergency shipments of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and transport aircraft to reinforce British positions in Egypt. The speed and scale of the response moved Churchill deeply. But it also reinforced a truth he could not ignore. Britain was no longer the senior partner. Outcomes increasingly turned on American strength. That same afternoon, as Churchill drafted messages to his commanders in Cairo and struggled to absorb the Tobruk disaster, detailed intelligence reports from Midway arrived. The battle that had taken place while he crossed the Atlantic now came sharply into focus. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. American naval forces had demonstrated operational skill equal to their industrial might. The Pacific, an arena defined since Pearl Harbor by Allied retreat, had suddenly produced a decisive American victory. The emotional contrast was staggering. Within 6 hours, Churchill confronted Britain's worst defeat in North Africa and America's greatest naval triumph in the Pacific. Despair and deliverance arrived together. The strategic consequences were both reassuring and unsettling. Midway proved that American forces could achieve decisive results when properly positioned and led. It secured the Central Pacific, eliminated the immediate threat to Hawaii, and shattered Japan's offensive momentum. For Britain, struggling to hold India and the Middle East, the victory meant Japanese carriers would not be reinforcing operations in the Indian Ocean. Britain's Eastern Empire had been spared, not by British ships, but by American carriers operating 6,000 miles from Washington. Yet Churchill also recognized a political danger. American public opinion, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, demanded vengeance against Japan. Newspapers called for a Pacific-first strategy. Members of Congress openly questioned why American lives and resources should be committed to Europe when Japan had struck first. Midway strengthened those arguments. If Roosevelt shifted priorities, Britain would face Germany and Italy without the American manpower, air power, and industrial support that made victory conceivable. The fragile Europe First Agreement, painfully negotiated over months, could unravel under domestic pressure. Churchill raised the issue privately with Roosevelt on June 22 during a walk through the White House gardens. His language was careful, but his concern unmistakable. Midway was a magnificent victory, he said. It proved American capability beyond doubt, but he hoped it would not alter the agreed strategic framework. Roosevelt's response was immediate and firm. Germany remained the primary threat. Europe first would stand. Midway had not changed American priorities, it had secured them. With the Pacific temporarily stabilized, the United States could commit resources to Europe without fear that its own shores faced imminent danger. The president's reasoning was grounded in realism. Defeating Japan required years, vast distances, forward bases, and sustained logistics across the world's largest ocean. Defeating Germany required concentration in Europe, where allies already fought and where victory would reshape the global balance of power. Midway made Europe first possible. Churchill left Washington on June 25 carrying mixed emotions. Tobruk still weighed heavily on him. British forces were retreating toward Egypt with Rommel in pursuit. Malta remained under siege. The Atlantic convoys continued to bleed. But Midway had achieved something Britain desperately needed. It proved that the Allies possessed a partner capable of winning decisive victories, not merely enduring losses with dignity. It stabilized the Pacific without demanding British resources. And it strengthened, rather than threatened, the alliance that represented Britain's only realistic path to victory. During the flight back to London, Churchill drafted a message to Admiral Pound. The American triumph in the Pacific, he wrote, had secured Britain's eastern position without diverting forces from critical theaters. It demonstrated strategic coordination of the highest order, American naval power deployed in service of collective Allied interests. What he did not write but fully understood was the deeper truth. Britain's survival now depended on American power in ways previous generations would have found unimaginable. An empire that once ruled the seas now relied on American carriers to defend British interests across an ocean. Midway had saved more than Hawaii. It had preserved the alliance itself. Churchill's public statement on June 8, 1942 was carefully crafted. The qualities of the United States Navy and Air Force and the American race, he declared, have shone forth in splendor. He praised bravery, devotion, leadership, qualities that honored sacrifice without revealing the intelligence and planning that truly shaped the victory. There was no mention of code breaking. No reference to intercepted transmissions or operational deception. This was deliberate. British leaders understood how fragile intelligence advantages were. One careless hint could force the enemy to change codes and erase years of effort overnight. Behind closed doors, assessments were colder and far more precise. An internal Admiralty memorandum circulated on June 10 reduced poetry to numbers. Japanese carrier strength in the Pacific had dropped from 10 fleet carriers to 6. Offensive capability severely degraded. The probability of renewed Japanese operations in the Indian Ocean was reduced from imminent to unlikely for the remainder of 1942. British positions in Asia had been stabilized by American action. The report detailed the losses. Akagi and Kaga, massive fleet carriers displacing over 40,000 tons each, capable of operating up to 80 aircraft. Soryu and Hiryu, slightly smaller but no less lethal. Together, they represented nearly 300 aircraft and thousands of trained pilots, losses Japan could not replace quickly. The memo concluded with understated relief. British forces in eastern territories have been spared a threat they lacked resources to counter. General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded his private thoughts on June 23. Unfiltered by diplomacy, his diary was blunt. The Americans have demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication at Midway, he wrote. Their intelligence preparation and operational coordination exceeded expectations. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers with precision that suggests complete confidence in his information. Brooke's surprise echoed across British leadership. The assumption that Americans would require years of costly mistakes had collapsed. The U.S. Navy had compressed a generation of learning into months. His diary ended with a sober admission. American performance in the Pacific now exceeded British capability. In the same waters, Britain had retreated from threats the Americans confronted and destroyed. This was not condemnation of British forces, Brooke noted, but recognition of reality. American industrial and military power had matured faster than anyone anticipated. After Midway, the intelligence bond between Britain and the United States deepened, because both nations now understood something irreversible had occurred. The balance within the alliance had shifted. For 2 years, British cryptographers at Bletchley Park had been quietly reading German Enigma traffic. Since 1940, the intelligence program codenamed Ultra had shaped almost every major British operation, from Atlantic convoy routes to battlefield decisions in North Africa. Its existence was guarded so closely that most senior officers never knew it existed at all. Across the Atlantic, American cryptographers had achieved a parallel breakthrough. They penetrated the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code, JN 25. The Americans called their intelligence magic. Like Ultra, it delivered a strategic advantage so decisive that protecting its secrecy became more important than nearly any battlefield success. When British intelligence officials learned how deeply American codebreakers had compromised Japanese communications, recognition was immediate and instinctive. Both nations were fighting enemies who had no idea their messages were being read. Both understood that a single careless disclosure could erase an advantage capable of deciding the war. Silence became a form of trust. Britain did not publicly acknowledge American intelligence success. The United States said nothing of enigma. Senior officers on both sides shared the burden of secrecy while exploiting intelligence with ruthless precision. This mutual vulnerability bound the alliance in ways no treaty ever could. Each side knew that if one intelligence system were compromised, both would suffer catastrophic consequences. By late June 1942, British leadership reached a conclusion no one dared express publicly, but everyone understood. Admiral Pound's personal note to King George VI, dated June 27, captured the reality with measured restraint. The Americans have achieved at Midway what we could not at Ceylon, the decisive defeat of Japanese carrier power. Our eastern territories are secured not by British arms, but by American action. The implications were unmistakable. A senior naval assessment stated it more bluntly: British strategic planning must now treat American naval dominance in the Pacific as a permanent condition. British forces could not replicate American success against Japanese carriers. Future operations in eastern theaters would depend on American power beyond British control. This was the unspoken truth British leaders absorbed throughout June. An empire that had commanded the seas for 2 centuries now relied on American carriers operating 6,000 miles away to protect British interests in Asia. Churchill's public praise was heartfelt, but behind closed doors, the assessment was colder and more unsettling. Britain could endure. Britain could resist. But Britain could not win alone. Midway made that undeniable. In July 1942, British war planners conducted a grim exercise. They asked a single question: what if the Americans had lost at Midway? The answer was devastating. Without that victory, Japan would have retained 10 operational fleet carriers through the summer. Intelligence indicated renewed Japanese operations in the Indian Ocean, possibly by August. Nagumo's carrier force, already bloodied at Midway, would instead have been reinforced. Japan could have concentrated 8 or 9 fleet carriers against British positions. The Eastern Fleet, withdrawn to East Africa after April's defeats, had no capacity to resist such strength. Ceylon would have fallen. The ports of Trincomalee and Colombo, the last British naval bases between Africa and Singapore, would have been lost. Japanese naval dominance would have stretched from Burma to Madagascar. Indian ports, Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, would have faced blockade or bombardment without effective response. The consequences would have rippled outward. India supplied over 2 million soldiers to British forces. Indian factories produced weapons and equipment for armies across 3 continents. Indian agriculture fed British troops from Egypt to Burma. Disrupting India meant dismantling Britain's ability to fight a global war. Admiral Somerville's July assessment stated the conclusion without embellishment. Absent American success at Midway, British position in the Indian Ocean would have become untenable by autumn 1942. Loss of Ceylon and disruption of Indian supply lines would have forced strategic retrenchment across all theaters. Midway prevented that outcome without a single British shot fired. Beyond averting catastrophe, the victory created something equally precious: time. Time Britain desperately needed. In North Africa, retreating forces stabilized at El Alamein. In early July, Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army and began rebuilding it for decisive action. That rebuilding required months, training, logistics, preparation. Without Midway, those months would never have existed. Japanese pressure in the Indian Ocean would have forced Britain to divert ships, aircraft, and manpower eastward, weakening North Africa beyond recovery. Instead, Midway bought 4 months. 4 months that made El Alamein possible. The Europe First strategy agreed upon in December 1941 survived only because the Pacific stabilized. Roosevelt faced enormous domestic pressure to prioritize Japan. Midway gave him political cover. It proved the Pacific could be contained while America built strength for Europe. Had Midway failed, American resources would have been pulled west. Britain would have faced Germany and Italy with diminished support, stretched past breaking. Churchill understood this fully. In a private letter to King George VI on July 14, he wrote with rare candor, "The American victory in the Pacific has secured our position in India without diverting forces we cannot spare. It preserves the strategic framework upon which our hopes for victory depend." He continued, "The balance within the alliance has shifted. American industrial power is now matched by strategic and tactical excellence. Our future depends not merely on American assistance, but on American power operating where British capability has proven insufficient." The irony was unavoidable. On June 21, 1942, British forces surrendered at Tobruk, one of the war's darkest moments. By that same date, American carriers had already reshaped the global balance at Midway. While Britain retreated where it fought directly, it was saved where American power acted independently. Midway was the battle Britain never planned, never commanded, and never participated in, but desperately needed. Years later, Churchill would call Midway a memorable American victory of cardinal importance to the whole Allied cause. The phrasing was diplomatic. The reality was starker. Without Midway, the Allied cause, meaning British survival, would have faced collapse across multiple theaters. British leaders knew this in 1942, even as they avoided saying it aloud. The future of the war and the fate of the empire now rested on American naval power operating in oceans Britain could no longer control. Relief, yes. Gratitude, absolutely. But also the quiet recognition that Britain's destiny was no longer entirely in British hands. The Americans had won the battle that saved the empire. Britain could no longer save itself.